Good evening and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. Do you know if your barber or hairdresser is doing a good job cutting your hair? Well, the state of Alabama thinks that you need their help in determining if they're getting a good haircut. At the beginning this year, barbers are going to be licensed by the state under what's known as occupational licensing laws. Here to talk about the effect of these occupational licensing laws in Alabama and some market alternatives to occupational licensing is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dan Smith.
It's a pleasure to be with you and your viewers this morning.
Dan, welcome to the show. Well, I guess welcome back to the show. Now, actually, the study that you've done on occupational licensing in Alabama is part of a larger project that we were undertaking here at the Johnson Center, right?
Yeah, so overall what the Johnson Center is doing is we're rolling out chapters from a book entitled Improving Lives in Alabama, A Vision for Economic Freedom and Prosperity. And what this book does is it brings together a collection of studies on a range of topics influencing Alabama's economy and the well-being of Alabamians. And what we do is we bring evidence to bear on important policy issues affecting Alabama and make policy recommendations both for the short term as well as for long-term policy recommendations, just for a more economically vibrant and stronger Alabama for generations to come.
We're going to be sort of like hopefully laying out a new vision or a new course of action, the longer term course of action, not just necessarily what can be done in the next year or so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What we're trying to do is just start a dialogue in our classroom, in our op-eds, in our radio interviews, TV interviews, just across the state, try to engage people in a dialogue about changing public policy, especially in key areas that are going to be very influential going forward, and just to make for a more prosperous, more economically vibrant Alabama going forward.
So, turning to your first chapter, our first contribution from this book, this issue of occupational licensing, could you tell for our viewers a little bit what exactly is occupational licensing?
Yeah, occupational licensing is a set of requirements necessary to enter a profession and begin to work and earn a living. That set of requirements is often set by a board of industry practitioners who set the requirements necessary to enter that profession. And the intended purpose of occupational licensing is to prevent or restrict unscrupulous or unqualified personnel from entering a profession and providing quality that could be detrimental or service that could be detrimental to consumer safety or quality.
So an example of this might be like the bar exam, right? People have to pass people have gone to law school and they have to try to pass the bar exam and then they can become licensed as lawyers, right?
Yeah, that's a great example of a barrier that's put in place to ensure consumers of a certain level of quality and safety.
And the important thing here is that you have to pass, you have to have this training or pass an exam or whatever to be able to practice, right?
Yeah, occupational licensing requires that you meet those requirements or else you cannot practice in any capacity within the state.
Now for things like, say, lawyers or doctors or maybe architects, we might think that such requirements are necessary or proper, but they're certainly not the only fields in Alabama that are subject to this licensing, is there?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting looking at the expansion of occupational licensing across the nation, not just within Alabama, but across the nation in general. It started with higher skilled professions such as lawyers, physical therapists, physicians. It was somewhat, you can argue that it's somewhat redundant at that point. Most people would say, yeah, you need some type of assurance of quality and safety, but after they graduate from an accredited medical school, do they really need to take another exam just to certify that they've met those requirements? But more concerning, and what my study focuses on, is the extension of occupational licensing to occupations such as auctioneering, locksmithing, and like manicurists and barbering. So more and more professions, especially professions that don't pose risk to consumers, are becoming licensed, and they're erecting substantial hurdles necessary to enter into those professions and begin to work.
And again, these are just all pictures of professions that are subject to licensing in Alabama, including like massage therapists and school bus drivers.
Yeah, absolutely. Just across the nation, we're seeing more and more occupations that have no discernible need for occupational licensing, getting occupational licensing, Usually not because consumers are demanding it, but because industry practitioners know that they can use that to block competition and raise the cost of the goods and services.
So how many occupations in Alabama are now licensed?
It's a difficult question finding out all the licensed occupations in Alabama, but from my study, I found over 140 different occupations that were licensed in the state of Alabama.
And here we have a list here. We don't anticipate that you can actually see this. It's just to show you how many different occupations you found were licensed, right?
Yeah, and over 1/4 of Alabama's workforce now requires a permission slip through occupational licensing just to enter into a profession and begin to work and earn a living.
Now, if some of our viewers are probably used to things like maybe getting a driver's license or getting a dog license, types of licenses that aren't very onerous to have to get. I mean, we might complain and grumble about having to go get a driver's license or get your driver's license renewed, but it's pretty straightforward, it's pretty standard, and not a huge hurdle to get a driver's license or maybe your general business license so you can open a business. With the occupational licensing, is that the same case here?
For some occupations, the process is pretty smooth and straightforward, but for most of these occupations, they require extensive training, exams, continuing education requirements, application fees, change of address fees, sometimes even a practice, so you have to get an occupational license to be a barber, and you have to get a license to open up a barber shop. So it adds up and represents a substantial hurdle to enter into some of these professions.
Here's just some statistics on one of our licensed professions here in Alabama, massage therapists, right?
Yeah, so massage therapists require 650 hours of training before they're allowed to give a massage. The initial application fee is $125. To establish an establishment for giving massages, it's another $100. And then biannually, they have to renew their license for $100 as well. And then they have to renew their establishment fee as well, and biannually that's $50 as well. So you can see for what should be a low entry cost profession, the cost of entering it raises substantially, especially if you include the cost of that 650 hours of training just to enter that profession.
Right. I mean, certainly, if you're going to be a massage therapist, you need some training, but 650 hours would seem like you could cover an awful lot of different types of massage in that time.
Yeah, what you're likely seeing is industry groups unnecessarily restricting access to the profession by making those training requirements lengthier than they need be.
Now, how expensive can it be to get a license in some of these fields?
The price can rise drastically. Architects, for example, pay over $1,600 for their license. Pharmacists end up paying close to $900. Even psychological technicians end up paying over $600. So these fees actually represent a pretty substantial burden. And once again, these are just the fees, not the cost of the training requirements or some of the continuing education requirements required by some of these occupations.
And what really strikes me about some of these fees is, like, for instance, if you're a psychologist or architect or a doctor, even a $1,000 fee isn't going to be that huge when you consider, how much money you're likely going to make for this. But there are certainly some of these fields where this entry fee or this initial license fee is quite significant. I mean, psychological technicians aren't going to be making nearly as much as psychologists, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and these fees are oftentimes passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So going to a pharmacist, well, it's going to cost more in Alabama because of the extensive costs necessary to enter that profession. And some of these lower end professions, even small licensing fees can represent substantial burdens to low-income Alabamians.
Now, in total, how much are we paying, or how much are our licensed professionals paying to the state?
The total amount paid in to cover occupational licensing, the total initial costs are staggering. My study finds that it was over $80 million in initial licensing fees, and then every year annually, people under occupational licensing in Alabama pay $30 million just to renew their licenses.
And that's money that likely has to come back from consumers in the form of higher prices, right?
Yes, most of that is going to be passed on to consumers, and they're going to end up driving up the cost of health care, drive up the cost of hiring an attorney, drive up the cost of getting a haircut. Those fees are going to be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, absolutely.
Now, what are some of the other impacts of licensing on some of these professions?
Yeah, so occupational licensing, the fees, they add up, and especially what my study finds is that it disproportionately harms low-income Alabamians. First, by erecting unnecessary fees that represent a substantial hurdle to enter a profession, blocking economic mobility and job choice by preventing low-income individuals from moving up into professions that should be low startup cost, and by allowing these industry groups to block competition, they raise the price of goods and services. That's passed on and disproportionately harms low-income groups. And then the last effect is through what's called the Cadillac effect, and this blocks consumer choice. So consumers under occupational licensing, they're faced with the dilemma. They can either purchase the high-quality service at an inflated price, which is Cadillac quality service at an inflated price, or they can go without or do it themselves. And as we'll discuss later on, this especially harms low-income groups that oftentimes are forced to go without rather than purchase the Cadillac price quality good or service.
So in terms of the impact of these entry fees, and here again are some of the different licensing fees. If you have to, and it's not just the licensing fees, it's probably more, the training is more important, the cost of this training. If you're from a wealthy family and you decide you want to be a massage therapist, it's probably not going to be a huge burden to be able to afford the training, for that field or some of these other fields. But if you're from a low-income family, I mean, then to try to get to try to get the money to pay for 600 or 1,000 hours worth of training, that's going to be pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my students here at Troy University is a tennis instructor, and tennis is not a licensed occupation, but they have certification that he can go to certain camps and he could pay for that experience that will allow him to move up in certification. And what he did is he started out being a tennis instructor, earning some money, getting better, improving his teaching methods. And now that he's saved up enough money, now he's actually going to go up for the certification. So occupational licensing would prevent that gaining on the job experience. It would prevent saving up the money to pay for some type of certification. Instead, it just says from the get-go, you need to pay this money up front, and low-income Alabamians oftentimes are not in the position to pay those upfront costs.
And sometimes that ends up, these license effects end up passed on to fields that don't necessarily need to have licensing. So I know that there's been a lot of stories in the news over the last few years about, like, say, hair braiders, and they sometimes get applied under the hairdressing regulations, and that ends up really impacting low-income or minority individuals who want to, say, take up hair braiding and are quite knowledgeable already, but they can't get into the field legally because they have to still get this licensing.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the extension and the recent extension of occupational licensing to barbering and hair shampooing is actually licensed in Alabama as well. These are occupations that should be readily available for entrepreneurial, low-income Alabamians that want to take the opportunity to be economically mobile, move up the economic ladder. And instead what these laws do is they prevent the access to that profession.
You know, Alabama isn't the only state to license professions in this fashion, so we don't want to sound like we're criticizing only Alabama in this case. How does Alabama stack compared to some of the other states?
Yeah, so across the nation, Alabama is the 24th most broadly and extensively licensed state in the nation, and it's the 30th most burdensome. It has the 38th most burdensome licensing laws. Now, on the face of it, that's pretty good. It's in the middle of the pack. It could be better. It could be worse. But what you have to do is you have to keep in mind that Alabama has one of the highest poverty rates in the nation and has suffered under 6%, over 6% unemployment for over 6 years. So the cost of occupational licensing are likely very substantial in Alabama compared to other states. Now, if you look at the states right around Alabama, there's some margins on which Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee are better, and some margins on which they are worse. Florida, just across the board, has particularly onerous licensing laws. So Alabama is much better than Florida, but if you're looking at Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, it's kind of a mixed bag of which one has better licensing laws overall.
So overall, we're not the worst by any stretch of the imagination, and Florida looks to be even worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Alabama's not the worst, but with unemployment being so high in Alabama, it's time for Alabama, rather than to follow the pack, it's time for Alabama to kind of take a lead in this and say, hey, this is disproportionately harming low-income individuals, and we need to clear away this regulatory apparatus and make the way for people to improve their lives and get back to work.
And one of the unexpected ways in which licensing can also end up negatively impacting consumers is in the aftermath of disasters. We see, because Florida is one of the most burdensome states. How can licenses affect the cost of recovering from a natural disaster like the tornadoes of 2011?
Yeah, so the costs of occupational licensing, especially in the aftermath of a disaster, are particularly disheartening. Right after a disaster strikes, you need emergency medical practitioners on hand. You need nurses, you need physicians, you need surgeons. You need people to get there and get there quick. With occupational licensing laws, if a state does not have emergency declaration that allows those people to come in from other states, they're prevented from entering into that state and providing health care to those people that desperately need it. And even in the aftermath of the immediate disaster, when you get to the recovery and rebuilding stage, people putting up houses, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, they're desperately needed in those areas to rebuild homes. And if they're not allowed to come from other states because of occupational licensing, it's going to drastically increase the cost of rebuilding and slow down the rebuilding efforts. Right. And as we know from research we've done on this topic, any delay in that rebuilding stage substantially hurts the ability of the community to come back comprehensively.
So we've been critical of licensing to this point, but the question could be, what's the alternative? I mean, after all, you can't possibly be proposing that, say, anybody can don a white coat and pretend to be a doctor and get in and start to perform surgery. I mean, we've all seen the commercials for Holiday Inn Express, where there's just somebody who happened to stay at the Holiday Inn Express who's going to be performing the surgery. Or even in more mundane cases of hair cutting, there can be problems. This is a favorite old episode of Friends here, where Monica gets a haircut from an unlicensed practitioner, Phoebe, and it doesn't turn out quite so well. So clearly, if we're not going to have occupational licensing handled by the government, there has to be some alternative way that you or I, who don't necessarily know if an architect or engineer or hairdresser, for that matter, is all that skilled, if they have these qualifications or not. What's the market alternative here?
Yeah, so my study suggests sensibly scaling back occupational licensing, both in its scope, how many how many occupations are licensed, as well as the burden of those requirements, especially in those professions that pose little risk to consumers or to consumers. Competitive markets are far better equipped to provide assurance of quality and safety to consumers without undermining occupational choice and consumer freedom. And competitive markets can do this through money-back guarantees, reputation, tipping, investigative reporting, online reviews, expert reviews, and voluntary certification. So there's all these market-provided ways for consumers to be assured of the quality and safety that they're purchasing, and those work far better without undermining economic freedom, and would be the path forward that my study would recommend for Alabama.
I guess you've already hinted at one of the ways this works is the tennis instructor. And I mean, that's like an example of voluntary or market-based certification, right?
Yeah, in such, you can also find it with the Institute for Highway Safety or Consumer Laboratories. There's a lot of rating agencies that will look at and determine the quality and give the mark of approval. Now, the difference between private certification or voluntary certification and occupational licensing is that someone can enter the profession, perform services like maybe cut haircuts for friends and family, learn how to do it right, and they get that experience, and then they can go for the private certification later on once they've built up the base to be able to afford it. Occupational licensing at the get-go says, no, you can't even practice this. You have to pay these substantial upfront costs. So voluntary certification would help low-income Alabamians get back to work and make a better life for themselves.
And one of the key differences here is that when you have a form of voluntary certification, that voluntary organization has no veto power. They can't prevent anybody from from trying to be, say, a tennis pro or try to give tennis lessons if you don't have their seal of approval, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people like Monica have far more recourse against bad haircuts than they do against an unscrupulous licensing board that systematically has the power to block competition, artificially raise the cost of a haircut.
Now, businesses can also help protect consumers in this regard too, because I mean, although you or I might not be able to evaluate a hairdresser or a barber, at least until they get a chance to cut our hair, if you run a barber shop, you're going to have an incentive to try to hire qualified people too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you own a barbershop and the barbers that you've hired consistently give bad haircuts or practice in an unsafe manner, consumers are going to find out really quickly, and word's going to spread around, and people will flee to the barbershop across the street. And the profit and loss system will work and say, hey, you're not providing the level of assurance and the level of quality that consumers want, and unless you shape up, you're going to go out of business.
We've also touched on the effects of occupational licensing on poor Alabamians and minorities. Now, occupational licensing actually has a pretty bad history in terms of having been used discriminatorily against minorities in the past, right?
Yeah, in fact, a former professor of mine at George Mason University, Walter Williams, he wrote a book recently called Race and Economics, and in that book he talks about how occupational licensing, how he finds evidence that occupational licensing not only disproportionately harms low-income groups, but also disproportionately harms minority groups, especially young African-American males.
How does that end up happening in practice?
Well, with occupational licensing, it erects substantial barriers to enter that profession, and oftentimes, especially in areas that have a lot of low-income minorities, these barriers just represent substantial hurdles to enter these professions and economically move up.
Now, in addition to some of these effects, occupational licensing, although it's offered as a way of trying to protect consumers, can end up sometimes actually harming consumers, leading to more injuries. Like, I mean, because what happens, like, say, if there are very few licensed electricians, or the licensed electricians are so expensive, what are people going to turn to?
Yeah, so on average, my study finds that occupational licensing, doing a kind of a meta-analysis of the existing research on occupational licensing, finds that occupational licensing fails to increase consumer safety or quality for the average consumer. And the reason for this is oftentimes consumers under occupational licensing are required to pay that high cost price or go without or do it themselves. And this, especially when it comes to something like putting up like a fan, doing some electrical wiring, there's many people across the state who look at the price of hiring an electrician and decide to try to do the wiring themselves. Mm-hmm. That's far more dangerous than, and this is statistically true, it's far more dangerous to do it yourself than to hire at least a handyman that has some experience. So the intended purpose of occupational licensing when it comes to electricians is to ensure consumers of safety and quality. However, because of the high cost of purchasing an electrician, many low-income groups, individuals actually end up doing it themselves, and that actually puts them at more risk for house fires. Or
sometimes you might turn to an unlicensed electrician, and then in that case, or in this case, the famous Three Stooges episode, if you turn to an unlicensed plumber, then you really have little or no assurance at all about the quality of these individuals, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Competitive markets would do a far better job of ensuring consumers that they were getting a quality product at a low price. Right now, the industry groups can, by blocking competition, just drastically increase the price, which prevents a lot of low-income groups from having access to this. And this is true when you look at veterinarian care. There in studies on this that when you have vets licensed, that low-income groups oftentimes opt to not take their family pet to the vet because they just can't afford it. So you actually see a lower quality care overall for family pets.
So you touched a little bit on the path forward here. I mean, what would be a good way we might try to go about rolling back occupational licensing, or maybe I guess conversely experimenting some with more market-based forms of certification?
Yeah, so policymakers should really consider scaling back occupational licensing, especially be very cautious to extend it to new occupations. One way to kind of gauge this is to look at other states. If other states don't license commercial interior designers, hair shampooers, locksmiths, auctioneers, then and they don't have any discernible safety risk to the people residing in those states, then Alabama policymakers could safely remove that occupational licensing without posing risk to Alabamians. Another way is to carefully monitor licensing boards and ensure that the requirements set forth actually ensure consumer safety and quality without setting it so excessively high that it raises the cost of goods and services so much that low-income Alabamians don't have access to those goods and services.
So we need to attempt to try to guard against the excessive training requirements, right?
Yeah, and in the best policy prescription for a long-term perspective is to transition more to voluntary or private certification. So this would transition, rather than having to have one monopoly state board decide who can practice and who can't, you have competing certification agencies saying, hey, this is a qualified personnel, and they stand by their reputation, and they can be sued if they certify someone that doesn't meet the requirements that they set forth. That would be a far better solution for creating long-term economic prosperity and ensuring consumer safety and quality in Alabama.
And so in the market, then, we could have some people who would certify, who would, maybe say that massage therapists need 650 hours or even maybe more than that of training to be their massage therapist, whereas other groups might allows massage therapists who have a lot less training, maybe 100 or 200 hours, right?
Yeah, and consumers would have the choice to choose the level of safety, quality, and price that they felt comfortable with. I think many of us go on Amazon or some online website, and you can filter by the price and by the quality, and most of us are pretty good at deciding for ourselves, okay, well, I'm willing to spend this much, but I want this quality, and to find a product that both meets our price range and our quality range. And removing or scaling back occupational licensing would just allow Alabama consumers to have that choice and would really help low-income Alabamians, both in having lower prices for getting the goods and services that they consume and need, and as well as allowing them more economic mobility and job choice and letting them get back to work.
Is there anything further that maybe the state could do to help along the market certification process? Or just get out of the way?
My fear is if government played a strong role in voluntary certification, that would turn into kind of a quasi occupational licensing. So the best way forward would be just a transition, especially in these fields that pose little risk to consumers. Might as well try it. Allow it to emerge, just like in this case of tennis. No one sees any need to certify tennis instructors. Naturally, the market has provided these certification levels, and people can get them, and they are an assurance of quality to the people that can afford them. If you think your child is particularly talented at tennis, well, you may be willing to pay for a highly certified tennis instructor. However, if you're just looking to get your kid outdoors and get them out in the sun playing around, well, you're probably not willing to pay the Cadillac quality price for a highly certified tennis instructor. So you're more likely to purchase one that probably isn't certified.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.